And not only the girls loved Elvis, but every man backstage was standing in the wings watching Elvis. He had that charisma, that magic, that a great performer needs.
The backstage dressing room was dead silent. Two music titans stood toe-to-toe, stripped of their fame. Johnny Cash leaned against the brick wall, his eyes locked on the man in the glittering jumpsuit. Elvis Presley was the biggest star on earth, yet he looked completely hollow. Cash took a slow breath, stepped forward, and threw down a brutal challenge. He dared the king to abandon the pop charts and sing raw, forbidden gospel music right then and there. Why did this single private dare terrify Elvis's handlers? What happened next did not just stun the eyewitnesses. It triggered a dark, hidden chain of events that altered the destiny of Elvis Presley forever. The midnight confrontation. The clock on the wall crept past midnight, but nobody in the room moved. Security guards stood frozen near the exit doors. Johnny Cash took one step closer to Elvis, his heavy leather boots scuffing the concrete floor. The silence between them felt heavy, like a physical weight. Cash crossed his arms over his black denim jacket. He did not blink. He looked directly at the gold rings on Elvis's fingers, then looked up into his eyes. "You are running out of time, Elvis," Cash said. His voice was a low rumble. "The flashy clothes and the movie contracts are a trap. You know it, and I know it. Prove to me you still have a soul. Sing a song from the old church." The managers in the corner shifted their weight nervously. One of them reached for a pocket watch, checking the minutes. A crowd of 30,000 people was waiting in the arena outside. The low hum of their voices vibrated right through the floorboards of the dressing room. A delay of even 10 minutes would cost the promoters thousands of dollars in city fines. Yet, nobody dared to break the tension. Why were the executives so terrified of a simple church hymn? The truth was buried in a contract signed just months earlier. Elvis was locked into a brutal schedule of pop tracks and Hollywood musicals. His inner circle managed every single breath he took. They chose his clothes. They picked his singles. They even decided who could walk into his dressing room. Johnny Cash was a wild card they could not control. He was a man who had walked through the gates of Folsom Prison and sang for the forgotten. He did not care about Hollywood profit margins. Elvis stared at the acoustic guitar, resting in an open velvet case. The wood was polished, catching the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights overhead. His hand hovered over the strings for a long moment. His fingers trembled. To the outside world, Elvis Presley was an untouchable god of rock and roll. But inside this room, under the piercing gaze of Johnny Cash, he looked like a terrified kid from Mississippi. He gripped the neck of the guitar. He did not look at his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, who was watching from the doorway with a scowl on his face. The Colonel hated surprises. He especially hated surprises that did not generate cash. He stepped forward, his cane clicking against the floor, ready to cut the meeting short. But Elvis raised his left hand, cutting the older man off without a word. "I still remember the words, John," Elvis whispered. He struck a single low chord. The sound was raw and unpolished. It was a massive departure from the lush orchestral arrangements that filled his recent record tracks. The Memphis Mafia members stepped back, sensing a shift in the room. They knew that if Elvis went off script now, the entire tour could derail. Cash did not smile. He simply nodded once, encouraging his friend to continue. He knew that Elvis was fighting a quiet war against his own legacy. The industry had transformed the young rebel into a commercial product. The dangerous edge that had defined his early days at Sun Records was completely gone, replaced by movie soundtracks and light-hearted pop tunes. Cash wanted to see if the real artist was still alive under the layers of fame. Elvis cleared his throat. The first line of the gospel song came out weak, almost a question. He stopped, tuned the third string with a sharp twist, and started over. This time, his voice filled the small dressing room. The tone was deep, rich, and dripping with real emotion. It was the sound of a man begging for a second chance. The security guards looked at each other in confusion. This was not the music they were paid to protect. It was old, traditional Southern gospel. It belonged in a wooden shack down a dirt road, not a massive metropolitan arena. But as the second verse began, the tension in the room started to change. The anger evaporated, replaced by something much more unpredictable. Colonel Tom Parker took a deep breath and chewed on his cigar. He knew this specific music was dangerous for business. In 1956, The record labels had fought hard to move Elvis away from his country and gospel roots. They wanted a global phenomenon, not a regional church singer. If the public found out that the king wanted to pivot to sacred music, millions of dollars in corporate sponsorships would vanish overnight. Elvis closed his eyes, completely lost in the melody. He forgot about the thousands of fans screaming his name outside the heavy doors. He forgot about the film scripts waiting on his desk in Los Angeles. For 3 minutes, he was just a boy singing for his survival. Cash stood perfectly still, listening to every single note, judging the performance with the ears of a master storyteller. The final chord faded out, leaving a ringing silence in the room. Elvis let his hands drop from the guitar strings. He looked up at Cash, waiting for a verdict. The silence stretched out for 5 seconds, then 10. The entire room held its collective breath, waiting to see how the man in black would respond to the king's hidden truth. Cash walked forward and placed a heavy hand on Elvis's shoulder. He did not offer a polite compliment. He did not tell him the singing was beautiful. He looked him dead in the eye and delivered a warning that would haunt Elvis for the rest of his life. "You still have it," Cash said softly, "but if you leave it in this room, it will kill you." The managers moved in immediately, breaking the spell. They pushed Elvis toward the stage door, throwing a glittering jacket over his shoulders. The guitars were packed away, the smoke cleared, and the encounter was officially over. Or so they thought. Neither man realized that a hidden tape recorder had been running in the background, capturing every single word of their conversation. Who had planted the machine, and what did they plan to do with the tape? The secrets of Memphis. The tape reel spun silently in a small leather suitcase hidden underneath the dressing room couch. It belonged to a local sound engineer named Bill Porter, a man who kept his eyes open and his mouth shut. Bill knew that backstage conversations between industry icons were worth more than gold. He sneaked back into the room 20 minutes after the arena emptied, retrieved the suitcase, and drove straight to a small house on the outskirts of Memphis. When he played the audio back in his dark living room, the clarity of the recording made his hands shake. The tape did not just capture a musical duet. It captured the exact moment Colonel Tom Parker realized he was losing control of his prize asset. The colonel spent the next morning frantically calling studio executives from his hotel room. He ordered a complete lockdown on Elvis's upcoming recording sessions. No unauthorized visitors were allowed within 2 blocks of the studio. The official reason given to the press was security, but the real target was Johnny Cash. Cash was already back on the road, riding in a dusty tour bus through the back roads of Arkansas. He stared out the window at the passing cotton fields, chewing on a matchstick. He knew the colonel was watching him. He also knew that Elvis was trapped in a system that cared nothing for music and everything for the box office. The two men had started in the same place, sharing a tiny stage at Sun Records in 1955. Back then, they traded guitar picks and shared cheap burgers at roadside diners. The contrast between their current lives was brutal. Cash lived in boots and faded denim, writing songs about train wrecks and prison cells. Elvis lived in a world of velvet curtains and white Cadillacs, surrounded by men who kept a percentage of his earnings. Cash did not envy the luxury. He felt a deep, growing anger about what the industry was doing to his friend. He picked up a notepad and jotted down a few lines of a new song, his pencil snapping under the force of his grip. Back in Memphis, Elvis walked into the Sun Record studio on Union Avenue. The room was small, hot, and smelled of stale coffee and electronic tubes. Sam Phillips, the legendary producer who discovered both men, sat behind the glass mixing console. Sam looked exhausted. He had sold Elvis's contract to RCA Records for $35,000, a massive sum at the time, but he always regretted letting the boy go. Elvis walked over to the microphone, looked at Sam through the glass, and asked a question that stopped the producer cold. "Sam, do you remember that old hymn we used to play when the machines were turned off?" Sam did not answer immediately. He looked at the RCA executives sitting on the studio couch, their notebooks open and their pens ready. Those men did not want old hymns. They wanted another teenage anthem that would sell 1 million copies by the weekend. One of the executives stood up, tapped his clipboard, and reminded Elvis that they were paying for studio time by the hour. The schedule demanded 3 pop tracks before 5 o'clock. Elvis did not argue. He simply turned his back to the control room, nodded to his guitar player, and started strumming. But he did not play the pop song on the sheet music. He launched right into a hard, driving rhythm that sounded identical to the challenge Cash had issued the night before. The studio musicians looked at each other, hesitated for 2 seconds, and then joined in. The RCA men screamed at Sam to cut the power to the microphones. Sam revoked. He leaned forward, hit the red record button, and watched the black needles on the volume meters slam into the red zone. The music coming through the monitors was fierce, holy, and completely unhinged. Elvis was not just singing, he was breaking out of his cage. The session lasted exactly 12 minutes before the Colonel walked through the front door and personally pulled the main power switch on the wall. The amplifiers died with a loud pop, leaving the room in total darkness for 3 seconds until the backup lights kicked on. Parker did not yell. He walked up to Elvis, took the guitar out of his hands, and handed it to a roadie. "We are done for the day, boys," the Colonel said, his voice flat and icy. "Go home." The musicians packed up their gear in total silence. Elvis did not look at his manager. He walked out the back door, got into his car, and drove through the rain to Graceland. He locked himself in the upstairs bedroom, refusing to see his friends, his family, or his girlfriend. The executives thought they had crushed the rebellion, but they vastly underestimated the letter Johnny Cash had mailed from a post office in Little Rock earlier that afternoon. The letter arrived at Graceland 2 days later, slipped under the front gate by a local delivery boy who accepted a $5 tip from Cash. It contained no long messages or emotional pleas. It was just a single sheet of paper with an address written in bold black ink. A small, independent recording studio in Nashville that operated completely outside the control of the major labels. The date for the secret meeting was set for the following Tuesday. Could Elvis slip past his handlers to meet Cash in the dark? The midnight escape. The side door of the Graceland estate clicked open at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning. Elvis stepped out into the humid Tennessee night, wearing a plain gray sweatshirt and a baseball cap pulled down low. He did not take any of his custom Cadillacs. Instead, he walked down the gravel path to a beat-up pickup truck belonging to one of his cousins. The engine coughed to life with a loud sputter, but the security guards at the front gate were deep asleep in their booth. Elvis threw the truck into gear and sped away down Highway 51, leaving his handlers behind in the dark. He drove for 3 straight hours without stopping for gas or coffee. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, fixed on the white lines of the highway. He kept checking his rearview mirror, looking for the flashing lights of a squad car or the headlights of the Colonel's private detectives. He knew that if he was caught tonight, the legal fallout would ruin him. His contracts contained strict morality clauses that forbade unauthorized public or private recordings. But the sound of Cash's voice in that dressing room was still ringing in his ears, louder than any legal threat. The truck pulled up to the alley behind Quonset Hut Studio in Nashville, just as the sky turned a pale gray. Johnny Cash was already waiting on the back porch, smoking a cigarette next to an old iron grease barrel. He did not say a word as Elvis climbed out of the rusted truck. He simply opened the heavy soundproof door and gestured for the king to enter. Inside, the studio was cold and smelled intensely of floor wax and tobacco. There were no flashing neon signs or luxury leather couches like the studios in Los Angeles. A single microphone stood in the center of the room, lit by a lone bulb hanging from a frayed black cord. 2 chairs sat near the piano, and a row of magnetic tape reels was already threaded onto the massive Ampex recorder in the corner. Cash walked over to the recording deck, flipped a heavy toggle switch, and watched the red indicator light warm up. He turned back to Elvis and pointed a blunt finger at the microphone. "We have exactly 4 hours before the studio owner arrives," Cash said, his voice flat. "No managers, no press, just the tape." Elvis pulled off his cap and tossed it onto the piano bench. He looked around the empty room, a sudden wave of panic hitting him. For the past 10 years, he had never recorded a single note without an army of executives telling him exactly how to stand, how to breathe, and how to smile. Now, there was nobody to hide behind. If his voice failed him now, he would have to face the truth of his own limitations alone. Why had he really risked his career to come to this empty room? The answer lay in a secret journal Elvis kept locked in his bedside table back home. For years, he wrote down his deepest fears about losing his voice and his connection to the church. He felt like an imposter in his own life, wearing costumes that felt heavier with each passing tour. Cash knew about this journal because Elvis had read a page of it to him during a drunken night in 1958. Cash never forgot those words. Elvis walked up to the microphone, his boots clicking against the linoleum tiles. He reached out and gripped the cold metal stand to steady his shaking hands. Cash picked up his acoustic guitar, sat down in one of the wooden chairs, and struck a slow, traditional gospel chord in the key of G. The music began as a low, mournful drag. Cash sang the first line of an old spiritual song about a traveler looking for a way home. His voice was steady, grounded, and completely devoid of theatrical tricks. He left plenty of space in the arrangement, waiting to see if Elvis would find the courage to jump into the deep end with him. Elvis took a deep, shuddering breath. He opened his mouth, but only a dry rasp came out. He stopped, cleared his throat, and looked over at Cash with an expression of pure agony. The pressure of his entire legacy was crushing him in that exact second. If he could not sing this simple song, it meant the critics were right. It meant he was just a product of clever marketing and good looks. Cash did not stop playing. He kept strumming that same chord over and over, his face as hard as stone. He did not offer any comfort or pity. He just looked at Elvis and nodded toward the microphone, demanding the truth. Elvis closed his eyes, cleared his mind of the Colonel, the fans, and the money, and tried one more time. This time, his voice hit the microphone like a lightning bolt. The raw power of his baritone rattled the glass window of the control booth. He did not use his famous vibrato or his stage grunts. He sang with a pure, terrifying intensity that sounded like a man fighting for his very life. The tape machine kept spinning, the black reels eating up the tape foot by foot. The two men traded verses, their voices locking together in a perfect, haunting harmony that had never been captured before in the history of modern music. They were completely lost in the performance, oblivious to the fact that a black sedan had just pulled into the alleyway directly outside the studio door. Someone was trying the locked handle of the back entrance. Who had tracked them to Nashville? The stolen session. The lock on the back door rattled violently, a metallic scratch cutting right through the final notes of the gospel hymn. Johnny Cash stopped his guitar strings with the flat of his palm. Elvis froze, his hand still clamping the cold steel of the microphone stand. Outside, the engine of the black sedan idled with a low, threatening thrum. Cash walked to the window, pulled back a corner of the dusty yellow blind, and peeked into the alleyway. A heavy-set man in a dark wool overcoat stood on the concrete steps, a ring of master keys jingling in his right hand. It was Lamar Fike, one of the most trusted members of Elvis's security detail. The colonel had sent him to bring the king back to Memphis, by force if necessary. Lamar selected a long silver key and slid it into the brass keyhole. Why had the colonel reacted with such extreme panic to a private recording? The urgency came down to a massive corporate merger between RCA Records and a major television network. The multi-million-dollar deal was scheduled for signatures later that morning. If rumors leaked that Elvis was abandoning his commercial pop style for unmarketable church music, the entire financial arrangement would collapse. The stock prices would tank before the opening bell on Wall Street. Cash walked back to the Ampex tape machine. He didn't hesitate. He slammed his hand onto the stop button, grabbed the metal edges of the take-up reel, and spun it backward by hand to protect the magnetic tape. He lifted the brown plastic reel off the spindle and tucked it flat inside his heavy denim jacket, zipping it up to his chin just as the back door swung open with a loud thud. Lamar stood in the doorway, his chest heaving from the cold morning air. He looked at Elvis, then at the empty recording console, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. He saw the red power light glowing on the amplifier rack. He smelled the fresh tobacco smoke hanging in the air. "The car is running, Elvis," Lamar said. His voice was flat, leaving zero room for debate. "We need to hit the road before the local reporters wake up. The colonel is waiting at the hotel in Memphis." Elvis didn't argue. He looked down at his boots, walked past Cash without making eye contact, and stepped out into the gray rain. He climbed into the back seat of the black sedan and pulled his baseball cap over his eyes. The car broke traction on the wet asphalt and disappeared down the narrow alleyway, leaving Cash standing alone on the studio floor. Cash walked back into the main room and looked at the empty microphone stand. He could still smell the sweet pomade Elvis used in his hair. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the stolen tape reel, and stared at the dark brown plastic. He knew he held a piece of history in his hands, but he also knew it was a dangerous weapon that could destroy his friend's entire career if it fell into the wrong hands. He drove back to his home in Hendersonville, went straight to the basement, and hid the plastic container inside an old iron ammunition box beneath his workbench. He locked the box with a heavy padlock and hid the key inside a hollowed-out dictionary on his bookshelf. He swore to himself that he would never play the recording for another living soul until Elvis was free from his contracts. Back in Memphis, the fallout was instantaneous. The colonel did not yell at Elvis. Instead, he systematically punished the people who had facilitated the escape. He fired the security guard who had fallen asleep at the Graceland gate. He canceled 3 upcoming tour dates in Texas, claiming Elvis had developed a sudden case of laryngitis. The real reason was to keep the king isolated from any outside influences. Elvis spent the next 3 days locked inside his trophy room, staring at his gold records. He refused to eat the meals his cooks prepared for him. He spent hours playing a white upright piano, singing the same gospel verses he had recorded with Cash in Nashville. The walls of Graceland were thick, but the sound of his grief leaked through the windows, triggering wild rumors among the fans waiting outside the iron gates. The executives thought they had successfully buried the incident, but they made a critical error. They forgot about Bill Porter, the sound engineer who had recorded the original backstage confrontation on his hidden machine. Bill had just sold a copy of his audio tape to a rival record promoter in New York for $500. The wheels were already turning for a massive public scandal. How would Cash stop the tape from hitting the radio waves? The New York blackmail. A brown paper envelope landed on the desk of a radio programmer in New York City on a rainy morning in 1962. Inside was a generic acetate disc with no label or markings. The programmer, a man named Alan Freed, placed the needle onto the groove, expecting a standard demo track from a local garage band. Instead, the unmistakable raw voice of Johnny Cash filled the office speakers, followed immediately by Elvis Presley singing a forbidden church hymn. Freed stopped the turntable with a sharp click. His telephone rang 10 seconds later. A raspy, anonymous voice on the other end gave him a simple ultimatum. He had 48 hours to play the bootleg recording on the evening airwaves, or the tape would be sold to a rival station across town. The blackmailer did not want money from the station. They wanted the pure chaos of destroying Elvis's clean corporate image. The news traveled down the telephone lines to Memphis within the hour. Colonel Tom Parker did not call his lawyers. He knew a legal battle would only confirm the authenticity of the recording. Instead, he called Johnny Cash directly at his home in Hendersonville. The colonel's voice lacked its usual theatrical warmth. It was sharp, cold, and dripping with desperation. "The boy is going to lose everything, John," the colonel said, his breath heavy through the receiver. "If that tape hits the airwaves in New York, the network cancels the television special. The contracts dissolve. You did this to him." Cash hung up the phone without answering. He walked down to his basement, unlocked the iron ammunition box beneath his workbench, and verified that his master reel was still intact. He realized instantly that the leak came from Bill Porter's original backstage recording. Cash packed a small leather bag, grabbed his car keys, and drove straight to the Nashville airport to catch the next flight north. He arrived at the New York radio station just as the sun was setting behind the skyscrapers. He walked past the receptionist without signing the guest log, pushed open the heavy glass door to Freed's private office, and stood in the doorway. Freed looked up, his jaw dropping at the sight of the towering man in black standing in front of his desk. Cash did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. He walked over to the turntable, picked up the acetate disc, and snapped it cleanly in half with his bare hands. The sharp crack of the plastic echoed through the small office. Freed stood up, his face pale, pointing at the shattered pieces on his desk. "That was my only copy, Cash," Freed stuttered, his hands shaking. "You can't just walk in here and destroy property." "There are no copies left," Cash said, leaning over the desk until he was inches from Freed's face. "You tell your anonymous caller that if they try to leak another second of that audio, I will personally find them. And I do not bring lawyers." The threat was effective. Freed was a radio man, not a gangster, and he knew Cash was a man who meant every single word he spoke. The New York broadcast was officially dead, but the victory was hollow. Back in Memphis, the psychological damage was already done. The pressure from the near leak pushed Elvis over a dangerous edge. Elvis started consuming heavy doses of prescription sedatives to cope with the constant surveillance. He felt like a prisoner inside Graceland, surrounded by bodyguards who reported his every move to the colonel. The vibrant, dangerous energy that had defined his early career was completely gone, replaced by a dull, chemically induced compliance. He began to look at his stage suits not as a symbol of success, but as a straitjacket. Cash flew back to Tennessee the next morning, but he did not go to Graceland. He knew that any contact from him would only bring more trouble down on Elvis's head. He returned to his workbench, placed his master tape back into the iron box, and turned the heavy key in the padlock. He decided to keep the recording buried until the time was right. Years passed, and the secret remained safe in the dark. Elvis went on to break box office records in Las Vegas, wearing increasingly heavy capes and glittering jewels. To the casual fan, he was still the king. But to Johnny Cash, watching from afar, the tragedy was unfolding exactly as he had predicted in that dressing room. The music industry was slowly consuming the man, piece by piece. Then, in December of 1973, a mysterious package arrived at Cash's home. It had no return address, but it contained a small gold-plated key and a brief note written in a shaky, almost unreadable handwriting. The note read, "Play the hymn, John. I am ready to go home." Who had sent the key, and what did it unlock? The gold-plated key unlocked a private safety deposit box in Memphis, containing the final diaries of a man trapped by his own myth. Johnny Cash kept that secret safe, refusing to exploit his friend's pain for profit or fame. The secret Nashville tape remained buried in the dark, a haunting reminder of the gospel album the world was never allowed to hear. Was Cash right about the industry killing the